Let me tell you something, and I want you to really listen to me, because what I'm about to say matters. Not for me, not for some talking head on television, but for your kids, for your grandkids, for the guy who used to work in that steel mill in Pittsburgh, who they told that his job just wasn't coming back, that he needed to retrain, that he needed to adapt, that the global economy had moved on and he needed to move on with it. That man right there, that's who this is about. Now, last week the Supreme Court handed down a ruling on the tariffs, and the left, oh, the left erupted. Champagne corks popping in the green rooms of CNN. The anchors on MSNBC could barely contain themselves. They were practically giddy. You'd have thought they'd won World War II. Breaking news banners everywhere. Trump defeated. Tariff revolution over. The whole machine kicked into overdrive, and they were celebrating. And I sat there watching it, and I thought to myself, these people still don't understand who they're dealing with. Because within hours, not days, hours, Donald Trump had already outmaneuvered every single one of them. Again. He signed an executive order, pivoted to authority no court had challenged, and imposed a 15% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a provision that has been sitting on the books since Gerald Ford was president. And while the left was still popping the champagne, Trump was already 3 moves ahead playing chess while they were playing checkers. Now let's talk about what the court actually said, because the media, the legacy media as I like to call them, because that's what they are, they're a legacy, a remnant of something that used to have credibility, they didn't tell you the full story. What the Supreme Court ruled was narrow. It said the president cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, to impose tariffs. That's it. That's the ruling. And even that ruling was deeply contested. Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh dissented, and I think history will show them to have been right. But here's the thing the media conveniently left on the cutting room floor. A substantial portion of President Trump's tariffs were never imposed under IEEPA to begin with. They were imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, National Security Authority, and Section 122, which addresses balance of payment problems. Tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on copper, on lumber, on automobiles, on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports. Those tariffs, untouched. And more than that, Justice Kavanaugh, in his dissenting opinion, essentially handed President Trump a detailed legal roadmap, a blueprint. And Trump, being Trump, didn't let that collect dust. He used it immediately. He launched new investigations under Section 301 and Section 232. Investigations that will result in permanent tariffs that are, as the man himself would say, legally bulletproof. And now, and this is the part that ought to send a chill down the spine of every globalist and every activist judge in every liberal district in this country, now that the Supreme Court has clarified the legal framework, any lower court that tries to block a Section 232 or 301 tariff gets laughed out of the room. The government cites the Supreme Court's own language. Game over. But it goes even further than that, because Trump identified yet another angle, licensing authority. Even where the court said he couldn't charge a tariff, the president retains the power to regulate importation. So instead of a tariff, you use licensing requirements. You make it operationally impossible for certain countries that have been exploiting the American market for decades to continue doing business here. You squeeze them without charging a single dime. And it's 100% constitutional. You know what that reminds me of? There's an old saying, don't tell me the rules, tell me the goal. Trump knows the goal. The goal is American sovereignty. The goal is the American worker. And he will find every legal avenue, every constitutional provision, every statutory authority available to him to get there, because the man is relentless. He is absolutely relentless. And then he issued the ultimatum. And I want you to understand the weight of this. The President of the United States looked at the entire world and said, any nation that thinks this court ruling is your escape hatch, any nation that thinks you can go back to the old arrangement where you manipulate your currency, subsidize your industries, and dump your products into American markets while throwing up barriers to ours, you are about to find out just how wrong you are. Higher tariffs, worse terms, no exceptions. Buyer beware. That is leadership. That is a president who puts America first. Not the Chamber of Commerce, not the hedge fund managers, not the multinational corporations who spent 40 years shipping American jobs overseas and then had the audacity to lecture working class Americans about the benefits of free trade while those Americans lost their homes. Let me tell you something about globalism, because I lived through the era when it was sold to us. It was sold beautifully. The theory was elegant. Remove the barriers. Let the invisible hand of the market work. Lift all boats. And I remember thinking at the time, this sounds reasonable. I'm a reasonable man. I can follow the logic. But you know what happened? Some boats got lifted. The mega yachts of the multinational executives, those boats got lifted. The interests of the Chinese Communist Party, those got lifted. And the factory towns of Ohio, of Michigan, of Pennsylvania, of West Virginia, those sank. And nobody in Washington, nobody, was willing to say it out loud. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, they all genuflected to the altar of free trade as though it was sacred doctrine handed down from the heavens, while American communities were hollowed out and American workers were told to adapt, until 2015, when a man came down an escalator in New York City and said what no one in Washington, in either party, had the guts to say. That free trade, as it had been practiced, was a raw deal for the American people. And they called him a clown. They said he didn't understand economics. The experts came out, the academics, the think tanks, the Nobel laureates. They explained, patiently, condescendingly, that Donald Trump simply didn't comprehend the nuances of global trade. They wrote the op-eds, they went on the television, and the American people, who had been living the consequences of those expert policies for 30 years, looked at those experts and said, "We don't believe you anymore." And they were right not to believe them. Because in Trump's first term, those same experts predicted catastrophe, from the tariffs on China and steel and aluminum. They screamed trade war. They screamed economic suicide. And what happened? Factories started returning. Supply chains began shifting. Investment started coming back to places that had been written off. And the conversation that had been forbidden in polite economic circles, the conversation about whether American workers deserve to be protected, that conversation became unavoidable. And in this second term, he went all in. Average U.S. tariffs rose from roughly 2% to 17%, the highest level in nearly a century. And the results speak for themselves. The United States collected a record $287 billion in customs duties in 2025, nearly triple what was collected the year before. That money isn't going to Beijing, that money isn't going to Brussels, it's going into the United States Treasury. The fiscal deficit dropped from 6.9% of GDP to 5.4%, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has set a target of 3% by 2028. And here's what the globalists, with all their models and all their projections and all their certainty, never predicted. Instead of retaliating en masse, countries around the world started copying Trump. They looked at what America was doing and said, wait, maybe we should be protecting our industries too. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development released a report confirming that governments using tariffs as strategic economic tools rose sharply in 2025. Economic nationalism is now a global phenomenon, and Trump started it. A Harvard study from the Belfer Center put it plainly. Trump's embrace of economic nationalism was the political earthquake that made everything that followed possible. It wasn't just a policy change, it was a paradigm shift. It shattered the neoliberal consensus that had dominated both parties for 40 years. And now, in his second term, he is cementing that shift into the foundation of American economic policy for a generation. Now, and I want to address this directly because it matters, the president also sent a very clear message to members of his own party who have gone wobbly on this. When 6 House Republicans voted with the Democrats to repeal the tariffs on Canada, Trump pulled his endorsement from Colorado's Jeff Hurd and backed his primary challenger, a Navy veteran named Hope Scheppelman. And the message could not have been more unambiguous. You are either with the American worker or you are not. There is no middle ground. There is no position of, I support the president but have concerns about the mechanism. No. You vote with the Democrats to strip away protection for American industry. You answer for that at home. You want to represent Washington in your district? Fine. But then Washington will represent you in the unemployment line. Because here is the fundamental truth that this entire moment is revealing. The era of the Washington consensus is over. The era of Davos globalism, where faceless bureaucrats in Geneva and Brussels decided the economic fate of the American worker, where multinational corporations wrote the trade rules that governed their own competitors, where American sovereignty was treated as an obstacle to be managed rather than a principle to be defended, that era is finished. What we are witnessing right now is the restoration of the oldest and most fundamental idea in Republican governance, that a nation's first obligation is to its own people, to its own workers, to its own families, to its own future. Not to an abstract theory, not to an international institution, not to a financial architecture designed by and for people who never worked a shift in their lives and have never set foot in the communities that their policies destroyed. The Supreme Court can issue whatever rulings it wishes. The globalists can throw whatever tantrums they choose. The rhinos can vote however their donors instruct them. None of it changes the fundamental reality. The genie is out of the bottle. Economic nationalism is here, in America, in Europe, in Asia, across the developed world. You cannot put it back. You cannot wish it away. You cannot write enough op-eds or convene enough panels or produce enough studies to make the American worker forget what 30 years of globalism did to his town. The man who made this possible, the man who took the slings and arrows, who endured the ridicule, who was indicted, impeached, investigated, and relentlessly targeted by the most powerful institutions in the Western world, and who kept going, that man is Donald J. Trump. And I'll tell you something. Whatever history ultimately writes about this era, and whatever you personally think of the man, when a generation from now, kids in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania grow up in communities that still have industries, still have manufacturing, still have a reason to stay, they may not know exactly how it happened, but it happened because someone decided that America was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth putting first. The age of the globalist free ride is over. The age of the American worker has just begun. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. Now, before you go, let me say this. If you made it this far, it means you care. It means you understand that what we talk about here is not noise. It is not gossip. It is not political theater. This is about the direction of a nation and the future our children inherit. And that is exactly why voices like this get buried. You already know how this works. If you are not seeing these videos in your feed, if you are not getting notifications, that is not an accident. When you challenge the narrative, when you question the consensus, when you refuse to bow to the approved talking points, the algorithm has a funny way of looking the other direction. So here is what you do. Subscribe if you have not already. Double check that you are still subscribed. Hit the notification bell. Like the video, not because it flatters me, but because it tells the system this conversation matters. Leave a comment, even if it is just one sentence, because engagement is oxygen. And most importantly, share this. Est it, email it, post it, put it where people can see it. Because the only way ideas survive in an environment like this is if ordinary people decide they are worth passing along. We do not have corporate backers. We do not have legacy media platforms. What we have is clarity, conviction, and you. And I will keep saying what needs to be said, calmly, clearly, without apology. This is Digital Robert Davi with Chris Dallas, out for now. We will see you in the next one.